Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. That's what we're going to be discussing today. You're listening to this in January. I hope you're not having a dry January. Hope you have a wet January. I don't know. This is
Because
an
you're already
episode.
wet.
It's already, well, yeah. I mean, here it's the rainy season to, push away any suggestions of any other connotations of what a wet January might be. Anyway, we're recording this actually at the end of the year. You're hearing this in mid-January, I think, listener. But for us, at least, we're recording this on the 30th of December and have that kind of ominous sense of ending, that sort of doomy sort of feeling. But for you, listener, that might not be the case. You will have already lived through the end. You will perhaps have listened to an episode we unlocked, a recent discussion which we've had with Lily Lynch on NATO and the end of neutrality in international relations as more countries join up with the Atlantic Bloc. That was available only to patrons, but we've now unlocked that because we think it's a good episode and everybody should listen to it if you are not yet a patron. Then patrons will also have heard our interview with Chris Cutrone on the death of the millennial left. And now we're going to have a very weighty theoretical discussion about the end, about modernity, utopia, and facing up to the abyss before us. So all cheery topics, and I'm very happy. Finally, and extend a welcome, very, very belated welcome to Juliano Fiori, who you can see there if you're watching this on video. Juliano is an essayist and the director of the Alameda Institute. He also has a PhD in intellectual history and was a rugby player at the Olympics. So, very accomplished person. Juliano, hello.
Hi. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to having this discussion. And, George and Phil as well, who are in the UK. Hello.
Hi.
Don't sound too enthusiastic that we're both.
Yeah, I
here
didn't mean it as an afterthought. I just, yeah, the introduction fell at the wrong place. It got all confused.
No, happy to be here at the end of the year. Made it through.
So what we're going to be talking about is, the last utopia, the final utopia, perhaps, or the last liberal utopia of human rights and humanitarianism. Maybe it was the last one. Maybe wokeism was the last utopia. Though there's a question about whether wokeism even represents anything utopian. So maybe that's something that we'll touch on. But we're dealing with this now. We're recording this in 2023 when certainly on the left there seems to be incredibly little hope about, little expectation of political advance, which is a pretty different situation to where we were, 3, certainly 4 or 5 years ago, where there was a rebirth in left optimism. And the decline of that optimism, I think, has had loads of impacts on the way the left sees the world and what it rallies around. And perhaps, if we think about what the left is rallying around today, it's maybe Palestine and climate change, and that's about it. Neither of which are particularly kind of hopeful subjects. Neither seem to provide avenues for progress, let alone radical transformation in any obvious sense anyway. So we're going to talk about humanitarianism first, and you're going to see where this leads to, because the next section of this is going to be on catastrophe, on ending, on the sense of perhaps there being very little rope left in liberal democracy. And then finally, we're going to finish on what it means to organize around this notion of ending, something that Julian was very interested in kind of uncovering, discovering, and discussing, and has written really interesting things exploring this issue. And we're also going to ask whether, does that mean emergency politics? Does it mean circumventing democracy? What does it mean to organize around catastrophe? So to get cracking, I think maybe it's worth just setting this up. I'm going to ask this to Juliano, but also Phil should jump in because he's also written a lot on this issue, studied it a lot. What was humanitarianism? Where do we place it historically? What were its ideas? What did it represent?
Well, I think it's maybe a question to which I should offer a qualified response. That is because to talk about what was humanitarianism suggests that humanitarianism itself is dead. And I'd probably not want to make such a grandiose historical claim, partly because I think it's sort of akin to saying liberalism is dead, which is something we've obviously heard a lot of in recent times. And although liberalism is a modern ideology, and I'd see humanitarianism as something like an ethos or a political ethos with its own inbuilt sociodicey, there is a declinism among aid workers and self-professed humanitarians that I think is relevant to discuss. But there is a continuity as well that runs through from sort of 19th century humanitarian ideas and practices to the contemporary time. And I've written on post-humanitarian reason. I've made reference to a post-humanitarian reason, which I suppose is an attempt to get to grips with an emerging tendency to engage in the same sort of emergency practices that were associated with humanitarianism in the long 1990s, but without any attempt to offer a sort of universalist pretext. That is, without any attempt to even make reference or allude to the universal value of life. And that's seen in some failed attempts to mobilize so-called humanitarian interventions, but also in extreme forms of humanitarian government. That's not to say that the post bit is the most dominant most dominant feature of that term that I use. I suppose I'll put post in brackets there, and that's partly because I think if we look back to humanitarianism in the 19th century, late 19th century in particular, and the way it was mobilized as a concept, it related to progress, to evolution, was often grounded in sort of positivistic ideas of evolution. Karl Mannheim, in his discussion of ideology and utopia, talked about a liberal humanitarianism and the pinnacle of it being the idea. And this is prevalent in the work of many self-described humanitarians at the turn of the 20th century. But there's a role for imagination in humanitarianism that is looking beyond the present. This changes, however, quite considerably through the course of the 20th century. And if we think about what we understand, generally speaking, to be humanitarianism today, or what is the dominant understanding of that term humanitarianism, it comes about in the aftermath of the crisis of the 1970s, and in particular, the rise of a new form of cross-border humanitarian response to conflict and disaster, which is much narrower. It's about emergency response, and it is essentially a form of moral practice in the present, a way of upholding certain ideas or certain ideals in the present to make the present livable. I think what we see emerging with this sort of post-humanitarian reason is a sort of concession or submission to an impossibility of reason, an impossibility to know things. There is an interesting work that's been done on this by social theorist and anthropologist Mark Duffield on post-humanitarianism, but a move from what he calls Homo economicus to Homo insius, right? The unrational or irrational being. But what I'm talking about when I discuss humanitarianism as a broader concept, and I suppose this is what you were making reference to with what was humanitarianism, it's really about trying to understand the role of this humanitarian ethos, or the moral politics of humanitarianism, in the context of structural changes that have occurred over the last 50 years. So rather than adopting the approach which is quite dominant, certainly within aid discourse, which is to see humanitarians as cleaning up the mess left by politics, and doing so in a time when they're trying to rescue the possibility or the hope of progress. I would tend to see a humanitarian politics broadly speaking, as something that emerges most particularly in the moment in which the future no longer seems possible. And so connecting the emergence of this humanitarian politics to a closing off of horizons, and a closing off of horizons once capitalism has reached its outer limits. So with the process of internationalization of capital and globalization in general, the disappearance of an outside seems to make any horizon of expectation beyond the present impossible rather. Sorry. And with this, a humanitarianism that emerges as the only thing that's possible, the only practice that's possible to try and recover some sort of meaning, even to collective life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so it seems like more the following away, rather than necessarily a change within humanitarianism, but the following away of other ways of seeing politics that leaves kind of humanitarianism being the last idea standing at the end of history. Is that kind of how you would
It's more than
understand it?
that, though, I think, because what strikes me in the discussions about humanitarianism, it becomes this kind of vortex, and to which all sorts of previous kind of frameworks get sucked into. So, for instance, I mean, very kind of, I don't know, very banal, not even banal, I mean, they're not banal, but say discussions about urban development in the past that would have been talking about, say, building cities, city planning, and so on in developing countries, post-colonial countries. That becomes kind of folded around discussions which are, as Juliano says, kind of based around kind of survivability, adaptability, humanitarianism. So any kind of discussion about which would have traditionally been, understood as melioration, but in a context of progressive improvement of some sort with a horizon, becomes kind of reworked around a humanitarian ethos. And so I think it's in a way like it's much it restructures all different kinds of policy and discourse domains that would have been framed differently in the past, I think. So it's much bigger than I think than just the kind of the image we have in our heads of kind of a crisis, a conflict or something, and aid workers.
Yeah, and I think here, if we think about the images that humanitarianism, the concept, might conjure for us, particularly in the post-Cold War period, or at least from the 1980s onwards, we might think of Live Aid, and then response to Ethiopian famine, and then the militarized humanitarianism of the 1990s. All of these are very much situated within a worldview, or emerge from a worldview that is about trying to bring the periphery, or let's say what was the third world, up to speed with the rest. And so humanitarianism is a thing that the West does to the rest. And I suppose what I've been trying to do, not for moral reasons, but for sort of for intellectual rigor and political reasons, perhaps, is to try to understand the emergence of humanitarianism as this moral politics, or this ethos, in a way that demonstrates its application within liberal democracies as well. And so I talk about the society of the humanitarian minimum. And what I mean then is by expanding the concept of humanitarianism to relate it to a minimalist moral politics, is to try and think about the relationship between these activities of big aid agencies on the periphery, but also the way in which government in Western liberal democracies was responding to a reduction of expectations, and the only remaining necessity, which was to maintain some form of survival, a sort of biopolitical form of government, let's say, and that.
So like well, I mean, I was going to ask. So, I mean, the decline of developmental expectations for the old third world, then kind of comes home, as it were, as well. That there's diminished expectations of first world development or advance, or at least for sections of the population who then get treated in humanitarian terms. Is that right?
Yeah, well,
Is that how you see it?
And you've written on Brazilianization and peripherization, and I think there's definitely a connection here. And in one of the essays that I shared with you about Melancholia and humanitarianism, I make the link between peripherization and the rise of humanitarian politics. But I'd also see that as working dialectically. It's not just something that is brought home unidirectionally. There is a process through which the emergence of states or powers on the periphery also relates directly to the emergency politics that is being generalized. And that is happening not just through the sort of mechanistic processes of development, but also through certain kinds of struggle, right? And struggle for national liberation in the decolonizing period, and then struggle for rights within what were, let's say, modern democracies that were incipient and already in collapse at birth.
Right. I mean, has it like the mood? I'm not even going to ask this as a question because it's obvious. The mood music has obviously changed. Like us as, you as a citizen in a, if you're in a first world country or in the capitalist core, you as a citizen or more appropriately as a consumer, used to be called upon to help poor suffering people out there. And obviously those appeals are kind of ring especially hollow today and will, I think, get kind of short shrift today. So at least at that level, we're not being addressed as potential humanitarians anymore, I don't think. And actually, you've written that, kind of referring to Trump, to right populism, to various other phenomena, that all of these have put paid to illusions of gradual and continuous inclusion in the humanitarian present. The last utopia of a moral society unencumbered by ideology has thus dissipated. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Going back to what I said previously about the emergence of the kind of humanitarianism that is recognizable to us today in the crisis of the 1970s, the closing of utopian or revolutionary horizons. Humanitarianism, for many, particularly a new breed of young, enthusiastic humanitarians, in the case that I draw upon in the essay that I mentioned, is the one of French humanitarians, in particular, Doctors Without Borders, and the move away from what they saw as ideology towards a kind of moral politics. And so humanitarianism itself became not just anti-totalitarian, but actually, because many of them were Maoists and certainly leftists at least, anti-communist to some extent. And so it was a reaction to previous utopian ideologies, which were suddenly seen as dangerous and were no longer valid. As such, the idea of humanitarianism as a force for inclusion within liberal democracy, and even sort of in its neoconservative variation, promotion of liberal democracy, becomes a sort of negative utopia. And what I mean by that is a utopia that is defined by its negation of all previous utopias. And it's still utopian in the sense that it involves a totalization of a particular present that doesn't exist. What I mean by that is, of course, there are aspects of liberal democracy that humanitarians, the more zealous, let's say anti-communist humanitarians of this period, recognized in the West in particular. But it was those elements that needed to be generalized or totalized. And I think that is a proposition which, in a sort of softer form, more amenable to sort of societies that were no longer really interested in politics as contestation or as a dispute for the future anyway. That became very attractive. And it became attractive not just to centrist technocrats, but to those on the center left and center right. Of course, there were those on the left who rejected this premise, rejected the idea that there was no revolution anywhere, and there were those on the far right who were never really interested in the universalist politics of life anyway. But broadly speaking, I think this is perhaps the humanitarian utopia, which I described then as the last utopia because it negates others, is in some sense the most expansive and inclusive utopia of all the modern utopias. And it's that seems to be directly challenged with the various movements that emerged in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And most significantly, I think, with the movements that emerged sort of around 2015, 2016 in Europe and North America, Trumpism to some extent, that targeted a humanitarian discourse as the root of the problem facing industrial and post-industrial society.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, obviously, Juliano, for listeners, it lives in Brazil, lives in Rio, and obviously, I mean, I think for us here, the rejection of human rights is something which is like corrosive of the body politic, is something that has been very present, I guess, in through Bolsonarism, but before that as well. I mean, any kind of like law and order politics would kind of seize on that, but it was particularly present kind of more recently in seeing as that which impeded having a degree of civilization, at least as they saw it, because the human rights is I'm trying to translate direitos dos manos, but kind of it's like the rights of the. It's not human rights; it's rights for criminals. Basically, that's what human rights is ultimately is.
Yeah, they say but, human rights for right humans, right?
Right. Basically, yeah. So I mean, obviously, it's kind of collapsing from the humanitarian discourse, kind of collapsing or being attacked from various sides, right? I don't know, Phil, if you want to.
Well, there was something because thinking about it, I wonder if things have come full circle with what's happening in Gaza at the moment. Because there you have the kind of perhaps the classic exemplar of a third world, an old third world liberation movement, the Palestinian struggle. And in the context of Gaza, on the one hand, the Palestinians have more solidarity, support, and sympathy around the world than they ever have done in the past, I think it's fair to say. But at the same time, the sympathy is overwhelmingly, it seems to me, humanitarian, essentially. It's concern for Palestinian suffering rather than support for a Palestinian project or for what the Palestinians could potentially achieve were they to carve out more rights for themselves or establish an independent Palestinian state. That doesn't seem, kind of to factor in at all to any of the discussions. And yet at the same time, you have this kind of this empty wish, I suppose, or this kind of placeholder of Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, the slogan of so many of the marches, without any meaningful, there's no meaningful agent to kind of carry that through. It's an empty wish, kind of an empty, a placeholder for something which I think it would be fair to say most of the protesters, demonstrators probably have no kind of sense of what it would mean to give substance or to fill up that slogan. And so the default, what occupies that is just humanitarian sympathy, kind of a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, a humanitarian pause, bring in aid. So I mean, I suppose I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, because it seems to me that humanitarianism is just kind of the period that we're in indicates that humanitarianism is still very strong, even in the kind of era in the aftermath of unipolarity, in the aftermath of globalization and so on, and to the point that it's now fully annexed an old kind of third worldist revolution, completely annexed it seems to me, and there's nothing outside of it, essentially.
Yeah, look, I think the first thing I'd say in response to that is I would never want to disregard the hopes for a future of any people struggling or those expressing solidarity with them. And that's despite any illusions that I might see that permeate those hopes, or that might provide a sort of unstable basis for those hopes. Just because, not because I think necessarily, through force of will, a future can be invented, but that there is enough at stake, there's a lot at stake in what's going on to recognize that people often need to project through their imagination, even sort of subjective imagination, just to be able to survive in the present. The future, even in its sort of idealistic configuration, has a function in the present to keep people going. So I wouldn't disregard that. On the other hand, I recognize certainly what you're saying when you point to a sort of dead end of politics and political struggle on the periphery more generally, but in the context of Palestine. And I think placing the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinian cause, within a broader context allows us to see what might have been exogenous factors. I think if you look about the way in which Palestinian movements under the umbrella of the PLO projected ideas of a different future, of freedom beyond necessity even, that is something that starts to disappear in the late 1970s and 1980s. In fact, it starts to disappear really when the PLO concedes to the possibility of a two-state solution. And I'm not saying that with any sort of passing any moral judgment on that, but there is a concomitance there. There's these things happen simultaneously, and it also happens at the same time when any sense of Israel as a socialistic project, of the kibbutz, that also disappears, and it disappears in the 1980s with the more radical introduction of neoliberal technologies, with the attempts to try to create or make of Israel a base for or new base for ventures of global capital. And so there's a disappearance of a future that is very much tied to the dissipation of the horizon or utopian horizon for the Palestinian struggle. I think in the case of what's been happening recently, that is expressive in the way in which people respond to the 7th of October, that there is a tendency to not concentrate on the politics of Hamas, for example, but also on the politics of Israel's security posture, and just see it as a sort of dialectical exchange of violence. And that is itself expressive of, very expressive in my view, of a sort of modern catastrophic logic that maybe we might get onto when we talk about catastrophe.
Right, yeah. Well, actually, maybe we should move on to that now, because, I think nowadays I guess the premise of this, to put it kind of bluntly, is that, shit sucks and it doesn't look like it's getting better. It's basically that the guarantees of a stable, relatively free life have been slipping away in most developed countries. I think, we were talking about Utopia. I think utopian dreams most likely died in the 1970s. I'm not sure if there was a future iteration of it. Perhaps liberal humanitarianism was it. I don't know. Then, the welfare state got eaten away. Then the culture seemed to stultify and become ever more commercialized. And then the bubble of security that existed in the 90s burst with 9/11 and with increasing acts of terrorism. And then on the other side of it, accompanied by increasing state power and surveillance. So that was gone. But, at least the economy was growing. And then the global financial crisis tore away at that as well. And then if you were on the left, at least there was some moments of expectation with the protests, with the mass protests around the world, or with left populism, and that seems to have gone as well. So, I mean, but if you're not on the left, I think you probably share this kind of feeling. And on the left, you probably have it even more. It's more intense. It's compounded, I think, by the fact that there's the contrast between some sense of hope and expectation versus what the horizon looks like now, which is to say that there is no real horizon, it seems. So I'd
qualify that slightly, Alex, which is I think it's that feeling of pressure, I think, in core states is much more recent than even the global financial crash. Because I think
Oh, I
really
agree.
it's,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I think it's really the return of higher interest rates and inflation together that has really kind of made palpable that sense of insecurity. So, I mean, obviously, I mean, countries like Greece and Spain, in Italy, were devastated by the sovereign debt crisis that came in the wake of the financial crash in 2008. By the mid 2010s, they were under that pressure. But in terms of, and I think there was that real sense of insecurity, and you had all the mortgage foreclosures in the US. But I think really that sense that there were ways, that kind of your standard of living could still be protected. I think that is the thing that has been most
Yeah.
decisively eroded, particularly in the kind of core Western states in the last few years. And that's principally, like I say, higher interest rates and inflation. And that, I think, is still kind of to play out.
Yeah.
So I suppose all I'm saying, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with the way in which you set it up. It's only to say that it's two very concrete and relatively recent changes, I think, that have really kind of put the squeeze on, even states which had up to this point, as a result of quantitative easing, managed to escape the worst of the global financial crash, such as the US, Britain, Germany in a different context. And now those countries, ordinary people who nonetheless managed to protect their living standards up until then, I think, are feeling that instability and precarity much more.
No, absolutely. That's yeah, a worthwhile corrective in saying how recent it is, but also something which we've discussed before. That Germany was kind of one of the last holders on to the end of history, that it still lived in this kind of post-historic bubble, and now things have come home to roost for Germany too. So even countries which seemed to a certain degree immune are now also facing the sense of everything suddenly crumbling and slipping away, and on loads of different terrains, right? Like the culture is bad, the economics don't work, you feel it in your pocket, but also politics is bad, right? So this compounded sense of things slipping away makes me want to ask to everyone. I guess I'll come to George first. What is there to hold on to? So, I mean, what's left of Western liberal democratic modernity?
Yeah. What are the silver linings? What are the rays of hope? I mean, yeah, it's not an easy question to answer, but the first thing that there are some good things left, and
What are they, George?
they're basically bourgeois rights. We still have these, at least nominally. So freedom of speech, freedom to associate, all these things which
He says
people are
from
like,
England, where if you send the wrong sort of
what are
tweet,
you
the police
talking
turn up
about?
your house.
Like,
I mean,
what
we
freedom
have
of speech?
we have these things nominally, and we need to regain them substantively. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was chatting with a friend of mine in the pub last night. Like, what was the best film that you saw this year? What was the best music? We really struggled. It's not it hasn't felt like a shining year in cultural production. You did mention this, Alex, but yeah, I think there are still some things about Western liberal democratic modernity to hang on to, but you probably have to kind of start right from the very beginning. So that's why you start from the liberal bourgeois subject and build from there.
but I mean, this liberal bourgeois subject, I mean, as we've discussed many times before, isn't really there. He's been replaced by, I mean, Juliano made reference to, I forgot the term he used, but somehow like the kind of irrational subject or something, but also the vulnerable subject. And in any way, the kind of traditional liberal bourgeois subject is long gone. So, I mean, I asked the question provocative because I'm obviously working towards something else, but it's still worth being blunt. Like, what actually is there to hold on to?
Yeah, I mean, that vulnerable subject, that is the dominant way that we see ourselves, and that is, that's, I guess, in some ways the basis for humanitarianism, or for a lot of contemporary politics, is that we do see ourselves and others as, fundamentally very, very, very vulnerable, and or vulnerated, already having been injured and requiring some kind of recourse of some sort. But yeah, I mean, it's almost got to that level of kind of a basicness or essentialness that you're not even thinking about some of the institutions. You're just thinking about the starting point, and it's not even there.
Juliano
I-
or Phil, whoever wants to jump in.
I think the starting point is there, but I think maybe that's all there is. and this is a point that I've made in a couple of texts, that the process of the development of modernity is one that itself has proven to be fragmentary. Modernity fragments. And in fact, we can say that certainly in cultural and moral terms, but in fact, in material terms, we can also see that ultimately that is what has happened. And it ultimately ends up stripping us back to the barest form of our existence, as a bare life. And from that position in which we are naked to the world, we're forced to change our relationship to it. And I don't say that with sort of any sense of a catastrophic alert, act now sort of thing. But that there is a sense, at least to me, in which certain illusions have dissipated and things become clearer. Certain ideas about even historical subjectivity, about a concreteness that would underlie certain struggles for a future, necessarily are challenged by material developments. And that forces a rethinking, even, I say tentatively, a reimagination of the way in which people organize for a future. But then I think, George, you are right. I don't think bourgeois rights have been entirely done away with. There are struggles within social institutions that are hard won through centuries of struggle, that something of them remains. And we see this even in the welfare state. I say that again, some degree of but there are people who are fighting hard to maintain universal rights to education and to health. And that shows that we're not absolutely dead yet. And from that, there is always some hope. And in fact, from the destruction that takes place of those, the destruction of those institutions, there is also, I suppose, dialectically a hope that is built into that process. And that is ultimately a modern process of progress to some extent. And that is, when things are done away with, we can see more clearly. In fact, apocalypse itself plays that very, very role. The apocalypse reveals to us the essence that was always there. Now, I suppose which apocalypse we're talking about is a question we'll get on to.
Just to jump in there, Alex. I mean, it makes me think of this conversation we had about Goran Thurborn's kind of big analysis of like the 21st century, which in some ways is the most pessimistic. It's way more pessimistic than talking about catastrophe, because his basic claim was that, during the 20th century and previously, you'd had these developments which had produced their own kind of contradictions, and that's, driving things forward. And he says, well, now you don't even have these processes that create things historical forces that will change them. So it's like the most kind of stasis doomerist version of like contemporary history. But I guess, Juliano, what I guess you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that there is at least a way out through apocalypse in a way. So that kind of catastrophe is at least it's a kind of overturning of some sort. Whereas I think Thurborn would say, no, there's no dialectics which create things which will negate the present. We're going to be stuck here forever, potentially.
I mean, we're going to, I think, delve a little bit more deeply into this, and hopefully we can kind of work together in kind of trying to figure something out today. But I'm not going to let Phil get away.
No, don't worry. I wasn't going to let me get away either. Yeah, so I think, this is going to sound a bit parochial, perhaps, but it really was brought home to me how bad things were when I when I read a piece in The Economist, of all places, talking about how the golden age of TV is over. And it made, the case about how kind of Amazon and Apple and Disney kind of muscling in onto streaming services mean that they're much more concerned with promoting their own brand rather than making good TV. The return of advertising to Netflix and the end of the era of low interest rates mean essentially that the freedom that the writers' room had in the era of The Sopranos and Breaking Bad and Mad Men and all the other kind of lesser shows that emerged in that period too, or even better shows, ones I've not mentioned, that's gone. And so I thought, like, that is really something. I could put up with all the other crap around, like all the terrible politics, all the terrible things happening in the world. But if you could come home and kind of turn on a good TV show, then at least there was some kind of refuge from it, right? And that's gone too now. And so I thought, like, yeah, that's right, because I haven't actually come across a good TV show recently that you would be able to talk about, that you could be confident that your social circle, either of friends or at work, were all watching and would kind of make a focal point of conversation. That's gone. And so perhaps the eclipse of that kind of private refuge is both hopeful and pessimistic.
What do you mean? So you have to kind of leave the house in the evening now? You can't
you got to leave the
watching
house in the
TV?
evening and kind
Yeah,
of wander
okay.
around the streets like a zombie.
They were right when they were critiquing the culture industry. This is what it did. It kept you passive,
Kept everyone at
glued
home.
to the TV at home, and now you have to go out there.
So I think that to really have that effect, I think you would need to kind of, I don't know how accurate it is, but it certainly stuck with me that the big thing that really brought people out onto the streets during the Arab Spring was when the government started blocking social media, because then people were forced to go out into the streets to see what was actually happening. And I think you'd probably have to have something, if there is any kind of effect of the any impact of those kind of new communication technologies, I think it would probably require something of a similar magnitude, a total shutdown, to provoke that kind, in a particular social and political context, to provoke that kind of response. But beyond the end of the golden age of TV, I would say a reason for hope, I think, is that the exhaustion of populism and technocracy, that kind of the end of that dialectic, which is unfortunately not imminent, but I think it will play itself out. And I think that is something hopeful at the end of the day, because I think what we can see in populism, for all of its kind of crudity and bombastic emptiness, and all of the problems associated with it, whether it's populism of the left or the right, is a stirring of mass politics, very weak and fumbling in the dark and with all sorts of problems. But it's an attempt, I think, people are searching for ways to articulate themselves in a collective politics that has thus far been eclipsed, not least by a kind of humanity, not least by humanitarian visions of what is kind of what social order and development should look like. So I think in that context, I think there is, we can look forward to what comes after populism and liberal technocracy, because at least for the foreseeable future, I mean, this is, we're saying this on the cusp of 2024, and what's going to be an enormous year for that context between Trump and Biden, as well as in the UK and other big elections. And so we've got there's a few more kind of electoral cycles to run, I think, before people start trying to look beyond technocracy and populism for better political forms. But that seems to me broadly, kind of that it has possibilities once that cycle begins to exhaust itself.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't want to sound anal, but I mean, I wasn't trying to get to what we might be hopeful for, but what seems like the collapse of the West, the collapse of modernity, whether there's any kind of line of continuation that even, we don't have to, we know the politics isn't good, but that there might be something deeper, sort of engine of modernity, which throws up new forms. And I mean, I say the West, but if you think about it, like, there's not really much to hold on to when you're looking at China. I mean, there's an incredible growth machine there, which is able to pull along maybe other countries. and at the very least kind of disturb previous arrangements, which maybe is good, but maybe isn't, so you're just holding on to the fact that stuff is changing. But as a civilizational example, in some ways it's far more scary than the West's own retreat from liberalism and democracy, in terms of the kind of degree of surveillance that it represents, and the way that I think Western politicians are tempted to imitate China. So, I only say this as a way of kind of maybe a bit of throat clearing, but say, we talk about kind of a moment of like the decline of the West, but, it's not relative economic decline, perhaps political and in kind of hard power terms. But as a civilization, it doesn't seem to be like a question of just the West. It seems like a kind of a global experience. But who knows? Maybe they're making good TV in China, so it's all right.
Alex, I'd be interested to hear actually what Phil sees as coming after the dialectic of what we call the dialectic of technocracy and populism. Are you saying that you see hope emerging from perhaps the hyperpolitics that might push through that dialectic? I asked that. Well, you referred to cultural forms, and it seems.
Yeah, I suppose the point about the TV thing was a tad facetious, but I suppose it was just that there seemed, that there seems to be such, so little on offer. Anywhere you look, I suppose, was what I was getting at. But in response to your question about what I see beyond, only that I think the, populism is the beginning, potentially at least the beginning of a new mass politics. Kind of looked at in a historical frame, from the vantage point of a possible future, you could look back on this period and see that this was the era in which the era of unipolar globalization, which was dominated by politics, was understood in purely liberal human rights terms, humanitarian terms. As that era falls apart, and partly under populist pressure and electoral revolts that take populist forms, that you get this, people are searching for new ways of collectively ordering their life. And so when they realize that, populism won't provide the answers that they're looking for, and that's a process which is a process of social learning. It's not sufficient for just having a theoretical critique of populism. People, I think, need to learn, that the promises are empty or limited, that people will begin looking for other kind of ways of doing mass politics, which are better than populism. And certainly other people will look for things which are worse than populism, no doubt. But at least there'll be political openings. So I think in a long time frame, I think there is a potential kind of hope for a revival of mass politics in so-called advanced democracies.
I think if we think about the dominant social and cultural form of the last 20 odd years is, I think, the platform, or the surface, the depthless surface, in fact, that Friedrich Jameson talked about as characteristic of postmodern cultural forms. But we see that as well with the movements or non-movements that emerged after the financial crisis. And it seems to me that in the 21st century, we've seen divisions or boundaries etched into that depthless surface in a way that they didn't exist, perhaps in the 1990s. That is, new inside-outside distinctions that are suggestive of a social antagonism, but they never really amount to such. They express themselves in political form, or in moral disputes often about identity. But the fluidity of postmodernity seems to have been done away with. In fact, even we might say we're in a sort of post-ironic age now, and as such, there seems to be a question as to whether we can give to that platform life, or that depthless surface on which we exist, on which we conduct our social lives, some sort of profundity, some sort of greater depth in our political engagements. That is, recognizing that these new divisions emerge. How do they establish themselves with depth to be able to form the basis of new mass movements?
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, I would go further. I mean, I'd say even like I think that postmodernism is the era of low interest rates, right? That kind of sense of superficiality and fluidity very much coincides with the 30, 40-year period of historically low interest rates that begin in the kind of mid to late 80s and stretch up right throughout the era of quantitative easing. Alan Green, during the Clinton era, Alan Greenspan era, right through to quantitative easing. And that era is over. I mean, interest rates are going to go down likely in the next year in Britain and in America. But nonetheless, they're going to be at a higher level than they have been, and it's going to make it much more difficult to sustain, keep the show on the road through debt, which has been, which is the kind of the postmodern kind of economic model. So that seems to me to be, that it will change the stakes, it will change the kinds of pressures that ordinary people are subject to, as well as, having forcing all sorts of recalibration in terms of the position of different groups and classes. And so how far that will cut more deeply into social antagonism, I think that will become clearer in time, I suppose. But part of that will be like tighter, also the era of tighter labor markets and the fact that labor has greater bargaining power. Again, it's a very, you don't want to kind of overstate it, but it seemed the kind of the crawl of union organizing and union militancy out of historic depths. That also seems to me to be good and hopeful, but without, but we're talking on the time frame of decades, I think, both in terms of populism and in terms of greater self-assertion by workers and labor organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the troubling aspect of a turn away from the superficiality, surfacelessness, consensus, and kind of fluidity and malleability of postmodern culture and postmodern society is that antagonisms are increasingly expressed in essentialized terms, and that's rather troubling about today. That it kind of returned to ethnic and whatever other identifications. I think, there's a bit, not to get onto this, but there's, the debate even amongst trans, whether trans is all about fluidity, about being one thing one day or another thing the next, or actually really about an essentialness, about I essentially identify as this inside me, and therefore I need my body to conform to that. And I kind of think it's the latter, and so there's lots of evidence of this turn to essentialism, which I think is a lot more troubling because it would be suggestive of an end to any kind of Enlightenment universalism, especially because it's kind of across the board. The right does essentialism, of course, obviously, but the left does too. But I don't want to get into that. So unless anyone's dying to add anything to that, I wanted to move on, and because we're working through something here, or at least that's my intention with this episode, which is that, so you have the sense of crisis, right? And you can pick whatever one you want, whether it's climate change or the risk of nuclear war, mass migration, threatening technological advances, economic collapse or collapse of a certain economic order. And Juliano, you've written that this sense of crisis contributes to generalized anxiety as well as melancholia for past ideals. So I wonder what you see as the sort of political upshots of this. I mean, I see two. I see like kind of the melancholia, I think, is more obviously expressed in an attempt to like return to the 1950s. In fact, the left and right both hold 1962 or whatever, I mean, I'm thinking of kind of Western Europe and North America, but hold that as more or less as their ideal that they wish to return to, albeit in radically different ways. For the right, it might be in a kind of racialized form, or one of a kind of focused around kind of a more coherent family life, whereas for the left, it's about the welfare state and so on. But nevertheless, that kind of left and right both are nostalgic, and they're nostalgic kind of for the same period. I don't know if that's kind of the thing you had in mind. And then on the other side, also just about anxiety. I think the anxiety about the future seems to express itself through anti-democratic politics, through a desire to declare an emergency, to kind of ring the bell and say, "Someone come in and take care of this. Let's stop all this. Let's all stop all this fussing around and going through procedure and whatnot. Let's just get stuff done."
Yeah, I think there's definitely an interaction between those two affective dispositions, melancholia and anxiety. The way in which I've discussed melancholia is, I suppose, it's broadening out from the left discussion on post-revolutionary melancholia, but trying to think about melancholia more generally as a social mood that is structuring of a collective temperament, or even it reflects a change in the structures of feeling in our time. And my argument has been that that is itself a consequence of the end of this last utopia of humanitarianism, into which are built struggles for human rights, etc., etc. And because that is a utopia that so many people bought into, this melancholy disposition is pretty general. And I'd say those who don't express that through their ideas and actions are often people who have been nostalgic for past ideals in a different way, those on the left and those on the sort of traditionalist right. And so didn't buy into this last utopia. But I distinguish melancholia from nostalgia. And in fact, I'd argue that melancholia can actually be a basis for construction. It is in different psychoanalytical, from different psychoanalytical perspectives, a disposition that reflects a loss of something, an object loss, according to Freud, an object loss that is withdrawn from consciousness. So it might well be a loss of an object that we never actually held on to, such as a utopia. The ideal of the utopia was never ours in the first place, and we lost it, and we engaged with that loss in a melancholy fashion. But from that position, Freud then sort of revising his ideas in Mourning and Melancholia, then talked about the way in which melancholia can contribute to character. But certainly it would seem that it provides a position from which one can look to new possibilities. It's not necessarily backwards facing in that sense, like nostalgia is, but it does potentially pacify for a period. And I think it then interacts directly with forms of anxiety, which are more perhaps reflective of an emergency politics, the pressures of hyper-productivity, the precarization of work and remote working, and people not knowing when they're supposed to work and having to work at different hours, and the expectations imposed upon people by social media, etc. I think that's a slightly distinct thing, but that melancholia does feed into. I would then say that is directly related to, that being melancholia here, is directly related to the way in which a new collective political horizon seems to have emerged, and that collective political horizon being catastrophe. And so I've talked about a time of catastrophe that we are now living in. And when I make that, yeah.
So what? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Maybe you were going to explain that, but maybe kind of just bluntly, what do you mean by catastrophe?
Right. So when I say that we're living in a time of catastrophe, it's not a sort of hysterical, shouty claim. I'm not writing in caps lock or putting an exclamation mark at the end. It's not a sort of attempt to mobilize people to action, sort of thing. Look, these things, they're really happening. We need to do something. In some sense, it's a reflection on that disposition of people recognizing something, imagining something collectively, and thinking that we need to do something. But it also strikes me as obviously and even shamefully parochial to think that it is one's own time in which the end will happen. And of course,
we should be so lucky,
Well, there have of course been apocalyptic or catastrophic and catastrophic imaginations that have formed in different moments of modern history. In the Romantic period, and just need to look at the number of works of Romantic art and literature that were entitled The Last Man, and the ways in which even ideas of anthropogenic climate change were discussed, the Malthusian ideas of overpopulation and reaching the period in which there would be a war over hunger and those sorts of things. Karl Jaspers in the early 1950s talked about the difference between an imaginary conception of apocalypse and the real possibility of the end of the world. But that in itself would seem to suggest that we are, through our own objective analysis, able to say, no, this thing is really happening now. However, the emergence of a collective imagination of catastrophe, be that in the form of ecological collapse, nuclear holocaust, or in fact just more generally a collapse of modernization, the disintegration of the base for the pursuit of modern ideals like the work society with rights and welfare, etc. That collective imagination doesn't emerge from nothing. So it also emerges from facts. It also emerges from scientific developments. And so in that respect, I'm not disregarding what underlies this imagination. On the contrary, in fact, I think if we're trying to engage with catastrophe normatively, politically, we need to try and work out what are the bases of the current imagination and what that means for organizing collectively. So what I'm then doing is, it's not also a positivistic claim about catastrophe. It's perhaps me pointing to a psychosociological observation that we see in our art and our literature, in our music, even catastrophe everywhere. And the entry to a time of catastrophe, to me, seems to be marked in more recent years by the assumption that, in fact, catastrophe, through our imagination, we realize that catastrophe is going to happen. And so we start to embrace collectively a politics of spoliation or a politics of destruction, voting in politicians who are ultimately telling the truth. And Bolsonaro is a good example. Telling the truth in the sense that they say, what we experience is a war for work. Go out there and fight each other. And so that's what people who are who are on the breadline are engaged in very precarious labor. Some of them have, in fact, decided against making claims for labor rights, because the flexibility is a way of working through this competition and embracing this apocalyptic vision of the end.
Yeah, which is something that we discussed on this podcast in relation to Argentina's new president, Javier Milei, where there's also a kind of certain appeal to amongst the kind of perhaps the most precarious of a kind of dog-eat-dog libertarianism. It's a way, as you say, it's a way of working through that. I mean, when hearing you talk about kind of apocalypse and the sense of that it's, your understanding of catastrophe being not a positive claim that everything is going to explode or implode or fall apart, but that we have collectively a sense of somehow impending catastrophe. Obviously, lots of people have talked about the way that cinema has imagined or even willed on, the idea of that, we desired 9/11, or Americans desired 9/11 through their film production because it was already there. And it puts me in mind of a great film by Michael Haneke, who's probably one of my favorite directors, The Time of the Wolf, with an always excellent Isabelle Huppert, who, it's basically a kind of post-apocalyptic scene, but unlike Hollywood, which somehow always imagines something heroic emerging out of this apocalypse. I mean, sometimes literally a hero, which leads kind of the people to some form of salvation. It's just grim and kind of, in some ways, unspectacular, and it's slow and grinding and barbaric, but just kind of, you don't really like anyone in it, and it's people behave in immoral ways. There is no moral kind of heroism that emerges through these desperate conditions. In fact, it leads to a moral lowering, the moral kind of, moral decay, I guess, amongst people because of the scarcity and the trying conditions into which they're put, that it becomes a war of all against all, but not even in the kind of crazy, zombie slasher kind of mode. It's just kind of slow and grinding. Anyway, the point of this is that I think, one, we should maybe recognize that more. I guess we should look that in the face, because the temptation of apocalypse and imagining catastrophe as somehow being redemptive is the fact that it isn't, and that like redemption won't emerge from the catastrophe we imagine that the culture industry keeps telling us is what is, what's around the corner, and is suggestive of us desiring even that apocalypse to happen. So I wonder if that, I mean, I don't know if that runs against what you're saying, or against it. Whether we should be honest with ourselves that there is not going to be any salvation through some great emergency.
Yeah, that's a point that's been raised by different catastrophists of the 20th century, and most notably perhaps Gunther Anders, who talked about an apocalypse without kingdom. So the apocalypse that reveals, but at the same time there's nothing after that. There's no kingdom of ends. I tend to draw a distinction between catastrophe and apocalypse. Apocalypse being a revelation, and a revelation of an essential truth that exists within, and I connect the development of modernity to catastrophe, in particular through the development of technology and the role that technology has in showing and demonstrating the process of development to us. And it seems to me that there is already a process of revelation that happens through technological developments that precede the catastrophe that we imagine on the horizon. The catastrophe on the horizon being eventually something that produces a sort of nothingness, a meaninglessness, or reveals the meaninglessness. But in fact, technology already does that by subjugating human subjectivities in different ways. I think you're right about the soothing effect of contemporary culture, art, and film in particular. So Slavoj Žižek refers to interpassivity, which is the vicarious experience of others in apocalyptic circumstances, and in fact, I think from the idea of apocalypse we do draw a sense of peace. This is a point that cultural theorist Eva Horn has made, that after the apocalypse, at least it will all be over so we can relax. And we can do that through film, because we see after the apocalypse there being this nothingness that is tranquil. Now that itself doesn't seem to imply hope. And the question then is, if we buy into sort of the more pessimistic visions like that of Gunther Anders, what is the point of doing anything at all? Do we just sort of fall into either a techno-fetishism or a fatalistic resignation? So from my reading of the development of modernity, I would tend to contest that position on the basis that there is always some element of contingency, and that the catastrophe that we see on the horizon, we never know when it's going to happen, or indeed if it will ever ultimately happen. We might live in the shadow always of nuclear weapons from now on, or live in the shadow of apocalyptic climate change. But there are possibilities of postponing, at the very least, those catastrophes that we collectively foresee. And there it's, I suppose, necessary to think through the continuities and discontinuities of modern development, of the contradictions of progress, and progress as sort of an antagonistic pole to catastrophe in some sense, to be able to work out what are the forms of organization that might lead to an imagination that could push back the catastrophic horizon beyond some other form of future.
Right. So, I mean, I guess sort of anti-catastrophism is what you're arguing for in some sense. Or, I mean, I think maybe, but this is not necessarily from what you said, but that we need to develop some sort of utopian horizon to drag us along and to clear away maybe the dark clouds. If that doesn't sound too kind of picture book.
Well, it's not. I mean, perhaps that implies a more idealistic exercise than I'm proposing, because there's been no shortage of exercising in reimagining shit for the last 40 years. And in fact,
right.
And in fact, even before then, the Rand Corporation and Hudson Institute, in the aftermath of the use of nuclear weapons, promoted the use of creativity and imagination to think about post-apocalyptic scenarios. But nowadays, you just need to look through the pages of policy think tanks and NGOs to see how much there is that has been produced on reimagining the state, reimagining society, reimagining aid, reimagining markets, all of us reimagining democracy. And I see that as part of, and sort of this futurology, the foresight exercise, as part of an epistemological posture, which is sort of the one that I was talking about before in my reference to Mark Duffield about Homo insius, the unreasoned or irrational being, our incapacity to think through risks, and then our concession to the risk society, and in contradiction then to the claims of Giddens, for example, about us being able to invent the future through our management or mitigation of risks. I would see all of this as part of an exercise in securitizing the present. So rather than just sitting around and imagining new utopias, what I'm suggesting is these new utopias, should they come about, will only emerge from strategy and organization. And that strategy and organization, at the end of modernity, once we have seen through the development of material process, that we can't take for granted historical subjectivities and a concreteness that would provide a basis for the rupture that invents a new future.
Well, so, I mean, let me take an idea which was very present in the last episode that we did with Chris Catrone, and George, I think, suggested that we kind of discuss this, in fact, because, I mean, it's basically the question about the weight of dead traditions, because a lot of the reimagining that you mentioned, I mean, particularly on the left, I don't mean so much kind of centrist think tanks, but also the strategizing, whatever, is so beholden to images derived from the experience of the new left, particularly, but even also of some of the failures of the old left, of Stalinism, that when we think we're reimagining or being creative or innovative, what we're doing is just unconsciously rehashing the past. And that's part of the stuckness of politics and stuckness of left politics, which is that it takes as the touchstones of left politics actually what are moments of failure or products of failure. And so, I mean, so in terms of if we're going to be serious that it's all fucking over, right? That like modernity as we knew it, 1789 to 1989 or whenever you wish to date it, but the kind of so much of it is over. Certainly the 20th century is over. We should forget, I don't mean not learn lessons from, but kind of really the 20th century is very much over. We don't belong to that period anymore. Perhaps we need to think more about the 19th century, or maybe not think about the historic parallels, but I mean that fundamentally we're in a situation where capitalism still exists. There's elements of modernity that still persist in terms of the contradictions and crises of modernity are still kind of ours. In fact, a lot of what we see in terms of irrationalism today is itself a kind of very classic crisis of modernity sort of manifestation or symptom. But that I think, how kind of trying to take seriously this idea, the idea that I think is associated with what you talk about in terms of catastrophism, which is the end of modernity, that then we have to return to 1806 or return to, I don't know, but effectively that we kind of wipe the slate clean with a lot of a lot of the accumulated tradition that we've picked up, because maybe none of that's useful. That we have to kind of return to the start. You can't return to, I mean, someone will be like, you have to return to the Greeks, or you have to return to blah, blah, blah. But let's not go that far. But in some sense, we need to wipe the slate clean of the second half of the 19th century and the 20th century.
And I think maybe my position is expressive of a reluctance to admit the end of the dialectic, and sort of with tongue in cheek, I would wear a hat that states make history dialectical again, or make history messianic again, or something like that.
I want to get one which is make Brazil the future again, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah. So what I'm suggesting is that in a time of catastrophe, there's a need to move beyond the conformity of postmodern theory, for sure, but there's also a need to move beyond nostalgia for the assurances of modernity and modernism. But that doesn't mean disregarding all modern ideals. In fact, if I thought that, I wouldn't have named the institute that created this year Alameda. So Alameda is a reference to the final speech of Salvador Allende. And my parents were exiled from Chile in 1973. And in his final speech, he said, sooner rather than later, the great Alamedas, that is the great avenues, will open up again through which the free man will walk to construct a better society. So the idea of a pathway or pathways to a future, I think is still absolutely necessary to struggles in the present, and struggles even for necessity, struggles for life. But that doesn't mean that we can rest upon the same secure premises that existed 50 years ago or more. And there are also certain problems with the modern project, broadly speaking. Obviously, that encompasses a huge amount of stuff that I think are worth recognizing. The fact that, of course, capitalism is centering itself, but modern philosophies of history were also centered on certain populations. And just for strategic reasons, let alone moral reasons, the need to engage with other traditions of struggle in a materialistic or with a materialistic basis become absolutely necessary. So I'm not by any means saying forget all that modern stuff. And in fact, this is maybe, Alex, I'll put the question back to you, because you like reading Robert Kurtz. You buy into his idea of collapse of modernization, more or less, as far as I recognize. And yet on your Twitter profile, you describe yourself as a modernist. So how do you marry those?
Look, I'm the host here. I don't get asked questions. This is not how this works.
Okay, well, I'll take it a bit further, because either you have to try and resolve that tension, or your self-description of as a modernist is just sort of postmodern irony.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
No, I mean, I'm in two minds about it. I'm genuinely kind of ambivalent. I think of myself sometimes as a retro modernist, but I at the same time am entirely cognizant of the fact that is bullshit. I mean, that's a bullshit idea that itself is kind of so self-contradictory, that like, how could you have a modernity and a modernism which is retro, be oriented to the future? But ultimately what it ends up being is a sort of the melancholia that you were talking about earlier, of a kind of referring back to the images of the future that we had in the past. And that's kind of sad, because I know we're not going to go back to 1960s national developmentalism, nor that matter to kind of 1910s Bolshevism or whatever, that kind of these things belong to the past. But I still think that there's the project of modernity as opposed to the process of modernity, to make that distinction. The process of modernity being kind of the machine, if you want to put it in simple terms, all the kind of automating and self-automating processes of things speeding up, things becoming turbulent and self-contradictory, and all that stuff that kind of happens not as a product of human subjects. And the project of modernity being the attempt to increase individual and collective autonomy and liberation from, natural and social determinants, right? So basically becoming freer, the project of individual and collective autonomy. And that's something that I would want to hold on to. And that's why I would still hold on to, being a modernist. But I just think maybe a lot of the politics of and political forms and social forms that we've known for the past 150 years are things that we should let go of, because they're no longer useful and refer to a time which is actually quite radically different from ours. Radically different from ours because they refer to a period in which capitalism had an outside. It had an outside either as a future, supposedly under socialism or socialist movements within capitalist countries, or indeed in kind of pre-modern or feudal past, which capitalism could still hope to kind of conquer, claim, rationalize, colonize, etc. And now we don't have that anymore. We live in a period of total capitalism, and I think we have to reckon with that. And that makes our world very, very different to what it has been over the 20th century and much of the 19th century, which is maybe why we need to go back to kind of the immediate post-Enlightenment period and start from there, rethink everything anew, but without kind of abandoning everything. You have to be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out. That's the idea. To finish on a really dumb note.
And I think broadly speaking, I'm in agreement with you on that. And sorry, my lights went out here because the power just cut again. But
speaking of modernity, yeah,
well, of de-development at least, I think there's perhaps a slight difference in the way that the targets that we choose, or the objects upon which we focus our analysis to try and work through that same problem. And my focus on catastrophe is ultimately aimed at working through the relationship between material process, imagination, ideology, and organization, right? I'm not supposed to be posing questions to you, but I think we've had this conversation before about the discussion of contemporary morality and we have light again, about contemporary morality and culture, identity. And I think as I said before, for moral and strategic reasons, but also for trying to understand the right object of analysis for the political intellectual project that I've embraced, I would tend to think that too much attention to questions of identity politics at times lead us to reify culture in a way that, in fact, grants it a greater force of determination in historical processes than it probably has or needs to. And I think here the point of focusing on collective imagination is actually to try to go beyond some of the moral disputes that are happening today on that depthless surface, and try to understand actually what is the collective basis on which these political and moral antagonisms are forming, and how can that transform into a basis for a social change or a mass movement leading to social change.
All right, very good. I think, to conclude, there are still people out there who want to be more free, and we should work with that, I guess. All right, unless anybody has any final points, Juliano, thanks very much for coming on. This feels like the beginning of a discussion, which we then have to kind of take on at a future point in time. Maybe when the catastrophe happens, maybe it's already happened by the time listeners are. I made that joke already about the previous episode, but we don't know. We don't know what's coming. Maybe January 2024 is when it all happens. Anyway, let us know, listener, if all has happened. Communicate to us from the future. All right, listeners, thank you for being with us. Juliano, thanks again for joining us. We'll do this again. George, Phil, thank you as well, and catch you next time.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.